I must first apologize. I've been dealing with really bad seasonal allergies for about a month and I cannot shake the congestion, so I apologize for me sounding the way that I do. Today we're going to be taking a look at a Trijicon 10-mile 3-18 by 44 in the first focal plane. I reviewed this scope like a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, and it's been sitting in the archive ever since. Until today, that is. Cracking the top off of this frankly beautiful box, underneath the foam, you will see that we have the optic inside of a nice neoprene cover. We also have a set of very nice Trijicon labeled Tenebrex caps, which are some excellent caps, and the fact that they're included in this is really nice. Also included is a sunshade, which I do not remove. Now, before we get too involved in talking about the optic, this is the non-HX version. There is an HX version, but the only thing I could really tell is different is the finish. This is a more satin finish, whereas the HX is a little bit more of a glossy finish. This scope was originally sent in to me by someone that has used it, which is why it has the ring marks on the tube, as well as that little dent down at the bottom, but none of that really affects its overall usability. Starting at the back with the fast focus eyepiece, all the way out, quarter turn in, and the wiggle test, this thing passes with the flying colors. It is very tight and solid. On to the magnification ring, we have a 180-degree sweep from minimum to maximum, which is completely standard, and that little cattail on the side is, well, wonderful. As far as illumination goes, we have offs in between each brightness setting, as well as two different colorways. We have green and red, and we will be showcasing that very shortly. As far as how the detent feels, it's pretty good. It's got a decent amount of resistance to it, so you don't have to worry too much about this thing accidentally slipping out of place, but it's not the best as far as a good, solid, positive feel. Minimum parallax is just shy of 15 yards, and all the way out to infinity is just about 270 degrees out. The side parallax knob does feel really good. It's damped quite well, and the texturing on the outside of most of these touch points is quite good. Inside the illumination compartment, we find a standard CR2032 battery with 6 fingers that keep that battery nice and secure. It's very standard for most Trijicon products, and I haven't had a real issue with any of them. On to the turrets, and I feel that the elevation turret on this is the weakest attribute of the scope overall. It only turns 8 mils per rotation, which is not great. It is non-locking, but it does have a zero-stop function. But more importantly than that, it just doesn't feel really great when you dial with it, as opposed to the windage, which actually has a really nice solid snap every single time you go from one detent to the next. The windage is capped, which I love on a scope that has a Christmas tree style reticle like this, so I'm at least very happy to see this. For most people that are going to be shooting with most medium to high powered variable optics, as long as there's a zero stop involved, it's good to go, and this at least has that. One area where this scope performs quite well is in the weight department, thanks to its 30mm tube and its 44mm front objective. It comes in at a svelte 24.7 ounces on my scale, which is 0.3 of an ounce heavier than what Trijicon claims it comes in at. For comparison's sake, the Strike Eagle 3-18 comes in just about 2.5 ounces heavier. And even though it's mounted in a GG&G mount, the Meopta Optica 6 3-18 by 50 comes in almost 7 ounces heavier. Pretty damn heavy, all things considered. But if you wanted to go extra light, you might be interested in something like the LHTs from Vortex, where this 3-15, albeit in the second focal plane, comes in significantly lighter than the rest. Trijicon did a really good job speccing this scope out. I think so far it's pretty solid, and it's fairly lightweight despite the fact that it's 15 inches long, which is quite huge. But the longer the scope, typically the better the glass. So let's get behind this thing and see how well it performs. There are only real 2 reticle options for the scope. Both of them are precision trees, one's in mil, like this one, and the other is in MOA. As far as this reticle at minimum magnification, I'd really like to see those posts at 369 extended. A lot of manufacturers don't opt to do this, and I don't know why. It would really help draw your eye to the center without having to rely on something like illumination. Happily, however, once we get into the more usable magnification ranges for a reticle like this, right around 8 to 10x, the reticle really comes into its own. However, at maximum magnification, you can see there's a slight bit of darkening to the outside edge of this image, at least here on my not so bright as being outside during the day tabletop. Trijicon does claim at maximum magnification a 2.4mm exit pupil, which is kind of on the small side, all things considered. For example, if we were to look at the Miyapta Optica 6, that claims a 2.8mm, which is quite significant. As far as the illumination though, this thing is extremely capable, very bright, both with the green and the red. It is one of the better performing MPVOs or even HPVOs when it comes to illumination brightness, and I'm really happy to see that. Also, the ability to go from green to red might be a party trick for a lot of people, but depending on where you're shooting and how you're shooting, having the ability to go from green to red, depending on what's going to be better fit your terrain or better suits your eye as far as it being able to pick up, it could really lend itself to you making that shot and you not. As I already stated earlier, the elevation turret on this thing is so far its weakest overall attribute, and it's unfortunate. As long as the thing tracks well, though, I can accept a turret that's not great, if it tracks well. As far as how the reticle lines up on my mill target, it is flawless, absolutely flawless. We don't have any shifting of the reticle on target despite whatever magnification we're at, and adjusting the side parallax doesn't show any significant shift as far as where the reticle should be on target. Everything looks very well lined up. So far, this is wonderful. Showcasing the frankly excellent illumination down here is plain as day to see. The illumination is super bright, but also doesn't bleed out. It doesn't create any sort of weird holographics going back and forth, giving you a weird shadow. As far as windage slop, I could not pick up any. And as far as the elevation, well, we're going to test that out momentarily. But first, a 4mm over 4mm up step test. So far, everything seems to be tracking quite good, both the windage and the elevation as we go to 1, and then slowly step it up to 2. This is important because what happens if you have to make a course adjustment on your 0 at any given time? Will it actually do well? Time will tell. As far as our windage, we're probably about 1/10 of a mil off, but we're also 1/10 of a mil off on our elevation, which is far more important than the windage. Resetting the windage back to 0, though, shows that it does track perfectly fine, but you can really start to notice how far down we are on our overall elevation gain, or rather increase of elevation gain. Continuing up, we go to a maximum capacity of this scope at just over 8 mils. But at 8 mils, you could see that we are 2/10 of a mil high at 8 mils, which means that if we were to be able to go all the way down to 10 mils, which would require a canted mount or a canted base, this thing would probably be as far as 3/10 of a mil off, which is pretty extreme when it comes to overall deviation. Happily, everything returns to 0 perfectly fine, but I'm not super enthusiastic to see that this thing has that much of a shift on our elevation gain, especially with how perfect the reticle lines up to my target. Just when you thought we were done looking at power transformers out of my former living room window, I pulled something out of the archive, and here we are, looking at my 30-yard power transformer, or rather, formerly my 30-yard power transformer. At minimum magnification, everything looks quite good. We don't have a whole lot of scope body showing, but a little bit more than I'd say I would like. Definitely in line with what's average out there, which is perfectly fine. Increasing the magnification to maximum, I dial in the side parallax to this 30-yard power transformer with ease, especially given the fact that this thing does have a 15-yard minimum side parallax, which is fantastic. Maximum green illumination is very bright, as is the red. Like I said earlier, the illumination on this scope was done super, super well. Definitely on the highest, if not the brightest end of any MPVO or HPVO I've ever reviewed. Well done, Trijicon. I'm still a big component that this thing on minimum magnification is a little bit hard to pick up that reticle in most situations, especially here. If the illumination was off, it would be a little bit harder to pick up on a darker background. Fortunately, we do have that bright illumination, so that does help, but I'd still like to see those posts at 369 extended and maybe the gradients be brought up a little bit more as far as its overall thickness goes. Before I increase the magnification, I set the side parallax to the 400-ish yards, which is what this building is set at, and we slowly increase the magnification to see if it's actually going to be accurate or not. I'm a big stickler for when a number is on something and it doesn't directly correlate. But here at 10x, everything looks really good. Both the reticle size, scale, illumination, and our overall sharpness of our target downrange. The green illumination isn't as vibrant as the red, but again, having the option is quite nice. Increasing the scope to its maximum magnification, you can see that we have to tweak the side parallax ever so slightly to extract the most out of this image. It's a very close scaling on the side, but I wouldn't say it's 100% perfect, but it still leaves us with a pretty good looking image. There's really good colors with the scope, contrast is pretty high, and our overall sharpness is pretty good. Our depth of field is also quite large. That tree to the 9 o'clock position is around the 250-300 yard mark, and the trees behind our brick building are around the 650 to 700 yard mark. So even at max magnification, this thing has a large depth of field, which is going to be good for a lot of shooters out there. Focusing our attention now on our 1,000-yard power tower, I dial in the side parallax to get it as good as possible. However, it doesn't seem anywhere near as sharp as it really could be. A lot of other scopes in this exact situation would perform a little bit better as far as the overall sharpness goes. But again, keep in mind this thing does have a small exit pupil of 2.4 millimeter, so maybe that has something to do with it. One area where the scope shines is the ability to have the illumination be shown when you're deep into the shadows. Image stability as far as our target downrange and our reticle is extremely high, even when you're pushed to the point where you can't see out the scope anymore. But more importantly than that, the illumination is still visible. So despite the fact that this thing does have a small exit pupil of only 2.4 millimeter at its maximum, on the bottom end it's actually quite large at 11.4 millimeter. Again, comparing to the Miyota Optica 6, at the minimum it's 9.5. which is a pretty substantial difference. This thing at the minimum magnification reacts really, really well to its overall eyebox and image stability. And the fact that the illumination is visible into the shadows, well, that right there, ladies and gentlemen, is super rare. Let me make this eyebox live for you a little bit more. At 3x, this thing is quite large, very easy to get behind. And again, that illumination helps draw your eye right to the center if in fact you need it. So far, so good. But as we increase the magnification, it does start to get a little bit tighter than I would personally like. Is it a deal breaker? I don't think so. It's probably just a little bit shy of what I'd consider average. Still quite usable, still quite practical. If you're having a really hard time getting behind this thing at higher magnifications, just try to back it down a little bit and it should fix most of your problems. However, the illumination still being visible for a lot of it is just, it's so nice to see that. I really wish more first focal plane scopes could perform like this. Focusing on our 1,000-yard house, we have everything dialed in as good as it's going to get. It was a very hot summer day, which is why we have the boiling mirage, which is going to affect the overall sharpness a fair amount. But we could still say a lot of details. Like in that window, you could still see all the individual panes of glass, which is pretty good. Dialing up the elevation to the maximum of about 8-ish mils, we reacquire our 0, and you can see that there's already a large shadow creeping up on the bottom half of this image. That is again due to the fact that this thing has a fairly narrow exit pupil. Adjusting the height of the camera, which would basically mean you have to adjust your cheek weld on your gun, will fix most of those issues. And when we do fix that issue, we don't really see any loss of sharpness when we are downrange. This is a very good performance, again, despite the fact it's got a slightly narrower exit pupil at max magnification and a slightly shifting eyebox. Low light performance is very important, especially if you plan on taking this scope hunting, which I think a lot of people would, especially if they want to build a hybrid rifle that's part tactical, part hunting, again, because this thing's only 24.4 ounces. At the minimum magnification, everything appears really good, but at the maximum magnification, you can see the shadows start to creep in fairly aggressively. Again, that little exit pupil of 2.4 millimeter is going to wreak havoc at the higher magnification in lower light environments. The illumination gets more than bright enough, but it doesn't really step down as low as some people might like. But I do think that if they had one or two steps down, it would probably benefit this scope as far as attracting certain people to it or not. For a lot of people, I think this might be a little bit too bright for them, which is actually very rare to say on basically any scope of any magnification nowadays. And one last thing to keep in mind, folks, when shooting in lower light environments, the larger your eye pupil dilates, the harder it's going to be to get behind any scope, especially at higher magnification. On to our first of several comparisons. We're going to be putting this up against a second focal plane Night Pearl Manual M6. This is a 2.5 to 15 by 50, comes in around $750, which is less than half the price of what you could find one of these Trijicon fours. I don't know if I mentioned the price earlier. I tried to in the beginning, but the 10 mile is right around $1,600, which is a lot of money, but it is a Japanese-made optic. Some of you might be questioning why I didn't compare the 10 mile to the second focal plane Credo, which I did not that long ago. And the reason is very simple. I just wanted to change it up a little bit. Now, these two are not what I would consider direct comparisons to one another. However, if you are looking for a possible hunting optic, something like the Night Pearl might interest you quite a bit. It has a very simple second focal plane reticle. The controls are very exceptional. It doesn't have great illumination, in fact, far from it, unfortunately. I am still trying to push Night Pearl to put fiber dot illumination in every single one of their scopes, but don't hold your breath on that one. But as far as the rest of the stats, these two actually stack up fairly close to one another. The Night Pearl is a little bit heavier at 26 ounces. Its overall field of view is not too far off. We have 40 feet for the Night Pearl at minimum to 35 feet for the 10 mile. And at the maximum, 5.9 with the 10 mile and 6.8 with the Night Pearl, which, considering there's a half X difference at the bottom end and a 3X difference on the top end, isn't too far off. As far as our exit pupil, it actually goes to the 10 mile at the minimum of 11.4, but it goes to the Night Pearl at the maximum of 3.3. Eye relief on both of these is basically 3.9 inches, which is about the same. Views through them, well, they speak for themselves. The 10 mile is on the average to maybe above average side. The Night Pearl is below average, and it has more scope body than you could see with the 10 mile. As far as overall image clarity here at 200 and now 300 yards, both of these are capable of producing a very good looking image, if I may be so bold. The 10 mile wins in a lot of different categories. I think it is the better overall package, but it's still more than twice the price of what you could find something like the Night Pearl. So as far as the Trijicon goes, here I think it performs quite well, especially with how bright the illumination is under this heavy, dark, shadowy canopy, but during a very bright, sunny day. It is a wonderful performing optic in a lot of regards. Next up is a Primary Arms SLX 3-18 by 50 in the first focal plane. You could find these for right around $500. They come in about 1.5 inches shorter than the 10 mile, but a whopping 7 ounces or so heavier. Pretty chunky boy. But if you're looking for more of a tactical style optic that isn't going to break the bank, maybe something like the SLX might fit your bill. As far as the overall field of view, they are basically identical, as well as the view looking through them. Identical. Unfortunately, though, the 10 mile is surpassed by the SLX's very narrow border around it. As far as our exit pupils, that is where the Primary Arms really suffers. It is 8 mils at minimum versus 11.4 for the 10 mile. The SLX, though, boasts a 2.8 millimeter exit pupil at the maximum versus the 10 miles 2.4, which is a substantial difference. Eye relief on both of these are, as near as makes no difference, about the same. The SLX is made in China. It still has most of the same features as the 10 mile, but it is, a third the price. So it's really more or less down to a budget orient as opposed to anything else. I do feel that the SLX is definitely geared more towards the precision side of things. Even though the posts at 3, 6, 9, and 12 on the SLX are full length, I think the reticle is a little bit harder to pick up than the precision tree of the 10 mile. And the illumination is nowhere near as good. So the 10 mile, I think, definitely fits that possible dual role tactical/hunting style a lot better than the SLX ever could. But if you're thinking about possibly focusing your attention more on precision shooting stuff and you don't want to, again, break the bank, something like the SLX is a good option. But the 10 mile does have better colors, better contrast, and better overall sharpness. As far as which one I would pick, to be brutally honest, I wouldn't mind running either of these optics. The 10 mile, I think, is a very good optic, but so is the SLX. It depends on your overall budget and as far as what the main objective with the optic is going to be. Next up is the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2 4-20 by 50. This is another first focal plane rifle scope that is also made in China and does cost, again, about a third the price of the 10 mile at around $560. It's also a little bit shorter by about 1.7 inches as opposed to the 10 mile and only about 3 ounces heavier. Its overall field of view downrange is going to be slightly different, again, because of the difference in overall magnification. At the minimum, it's only going to be 27.9 feet to 35.3 feet for the 10 mile. However, at the maximum, there isn't that big of a difference, despite the fact there's a 2x difference favoring the Helos, 5.9 to 5.6 feet. Eye relief is a little bit closer for the Helos at 3.6 to about 3.7, 3.8 for the 10 mile. As far as how these two scopes perform optically, they're both really good. I think the edge still goes to the 10 mile, but not by a significant margin. The Helos performs extremely well, has very similar size view looking through it, as well as very similar scope body. I do like the turrets of the Helos more than on the 10 mile by a fair margin. As far as the overall construction and feel of it, the 10 mile definitely wins. Again, Chinese versus Japanese, there is something to play there. However, I do prefer the reticle of the Helos. The posts at 3, 6, and 9 are full length, and the very similar spec sort of precision tree in the middle are basically the same between these two scopes. The Helos reticle does give a little bit more information as far as a finer stadia line on our windage and elevation, so if that's important to you, definitely go for the Helos. Budget aside though, both of these are quite good optics. The 10 mile, I think, does edge out the Helos ever so slightly when it comes to overall sharpness, clarity, colors, and contrast, but the Helos is not that far behind, especially when you factor in there's over $1,000 price difference between these two. The illumination on the Helos is also quite good, but it doesn't quite match up to what the 10 mile is capable of doing. Overall, budget, budget, budget. If you're on a lower budget, the Helos is definitely the clear winner. If you don't really care so much about budget, but you want the better product, it's a bit of a toss-up. More or less if you want a Chinese-made versus a Japanese-made optic. But if you want a Japanese-made optic, that's going to cost around $1,600, $1,800, maybe closer to $2,000. Well, there's one serious contender we have to take a look at. Ever since I reviewed the Nightforce NX8 2.5-20 by 50 in the first focal plane, I think it's been in at least most of my MPVO comparison segments for every other review going forward, and rightfully so, for around the $2,000 price mark. So yes, it's more expensive than the 10 mile, but you're also getting, I feel, more scope. Let me explain. There's a 3-inch difference for the NX8 being shorter at 12 inches, only a 3.9 ounce weight penalty for the NX8 at 28 ounces. Our overall field of view is going to favor the NX8, again, because we have half X difference on the bottom. So we have 41.8 feet for the NX8 to 35.3 feet for the 10 mile. However, the NX8 at maximum magnification of 20x is capable of 7 feet versus the 10 miles, quite anemic 5.9. Once more, the 10 mile does impress with its minimum exit pupil of 11.4 millimeter to the Night Force's rather pathetic 7.1 millimeter. However, at the top end, the NX8 starts to come alive at 2.5 millimeter versus 2.4 millimeter, despite, again, the 2x difference. So these two scopes are kind of sort of similar, especially given that, the eye reliefs are fairly similar on these as well. But again, they're geared towards different roles and objectives. The TENMILE is a little bit favoring the lower end magnification as opposed to top end, whereas the NX8 is favoring the top end as opposed to the lower end. The same can be said as far as the reticle scaling. The MIL XT reticle on the NX8 is amazing, but it is invisible to the eye below 8x. From 8 to 10, it starts to get usable, but it really favors being on the higher end of the magnification. And so does, the exit pupil being larger than what the TENMILE is, despite the fact there's a 2x difference, is quite impressive. But both of these feature windage turrets that are capped and elevation turrets that are non-locking and exposed, but offer a zero stop. The NX8, by the way, beats the TENMILE as far as its overall physical controls and feeling. The NX8 really does feel superb. Optically, I think I also have to give it to the NX8 by a slight margin. Illumination, definitely to the TENMILE. There's a lot to go back and forth between these two. If you're looking for more precision focused, go with the NX8. If you're looking for more of a dual purpose role, like I've said this entire video, the TENMILE is quite a good optic. Now, there's only one reason why I wouldn't give a resounding go by the NX8 if you're focused on more precision, and that is the Primary Arms PLX-C 2.5 to 50 that's coming out. I've heard nothing but amazing things. There's not much else for me to say, ladies and gentlemen. I really do feel like Trijicon modeled the scope more towards the hybrid sort of role as opposed to just one extreme or the next. Very similar with like a lot of other optics that we've looked at. It sort of fits in a multi-purpose role. And there's nothing wrong with that, especially considering this really doesn't give up a whole lot on either ends of the spectrum. Sure, it's a little bit on the longer side, but it is lighter than a lot of the other scopes that we looked at. Sometimes even by a fair margin. About 20% is huge, especially if you're going to be carrying this on your back for long periods of time. It doesn't give up anything as far as our image sharpness, clarity, brightness, or contrast until you get to the higher magnification, of course, where the small exit pupil really does hinder this scope's overall performance. Are there some things I would like to see changed? Yes. Physically, the only thing I could really nitpick is the elevation turret. I would like to see 10 mils per rotation, standard across the board on every single optic that's available in mils. Would I like to see a locking turret on it? I would, but I think I would prefer if this thing had a better sounding and feeling elevation turret on the detent as opposed to a lock. The zero stop mechanism on this, I didn't showcase it, but it's more than suitable for any sort of environment you're going to be taking the scope into. If you're not a fan of the matte overall finish, guess what? You could buy the HX, which has more of a satin finish, which I wouldn't recommend for a lot of people unless you're throwing it in mud all the time and you want to wipe it clean every single time you use it, in which case, go for the HX. But if you're in a tactical or hunting role, the less shiny stuff you have, the better. So why wouldn't you go for the matte finish of this over the HX? I really don't know. Now, the only other thing I could talk about is this thing's overall durability and longevity. But happily, the individual on Rockslide, whose name I cannot pronounce, so I'm just going to throw it up on the screen right now. I'm going to link his review to this thing on Rockslide in the comment section below, so go check that out. He torture tests scopes in real-world environments better than anyone else and documents it better than anyone else there is. He's frankly amazing. There you go. Kudos to you, and shout out as well. And he's had this optic for a very long time on multiple different scopes and never had a failure. This thing held zero, kept its repeatability, didn't lose any sort of optical performance or clarity or usability at all. And he says, it swapped out a scope for his, I think he had it on a Mark 12 last I saw, that had two scopes that lost zero, and this thing has been holding up perfectly fine despite tons and tons and tons of abuse. So If you're curious about how well this scope should be able to handle daily abuse, from his review alone, I would feel totally confident taking this thing in the worst environments on the planet. And with that note, ladies and gentlemen, there's not much else to say other than a resounding thank you to the individual that lent this to me for me to review it like 2+ years ago. I apologize for the mega delay, but other things take precedence. Fortunately, I have a little bit of time to start getting through my backlog of stuff so I can get much more in the time with newer and better optics. Before I thank all of you for watching, would I recommend this scope? I would. I think it's a really nice setup package. Sure, there are some things I would love to see changed, but if you're in that, I kind of want a hybrid roll optic, I really do think you could do far worse for the money. And with that, thank you all very much for watching. As always, I'll see you again next time. And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you could still help by using my affiliate links in the description below and/or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.